reconstruct a sound into its component parts and either sequence them in different orders or layer them in different combinations in order to create variation, a so-called procedural approach to sound design. We'll look at how we can also change the sounds themselves through modulation of their pitch and volume, both through discrete changes and through use of envelopes. In the demonstration project, we have some pigs in a couple of pens over here on the left-hand side of the village, and this is the sound cue for the pigs. We have a kind of faint background chewing sound, and then every now and again we have a pig grunt, and you can notice this modulator node. Now the first one here is a default settings of the modulator node, so it's pitch shifting 0.95 to 1.05, so a very subtle pitch shift. The second one is a bit more extreme. We've gone 0.8 to 1.05, and we've got quite a lot of variance in the volume here. Another tip is if you double click on the nodes, instead of playing play node, you can actually double click to audition them. So if we just connect up a single sound to this second modulator, you can hear the pitch shifting going on. Pitch shifting can be a useful way of varying sounds. It's often a good idea to have some subtle pitch shifting if you anticipate many of the same sounds in a particular area, since this can avoid phasing issues. But unless you're after a specific creative effect, you should probably avoid overdoing it, since it can sound odd and unnatural. Another way of modulating the sound to create variations is to change the volume. This is something you're likely to be doing pretty consistently, particularly for natural sounds, since they're likely to vary in volume. If we go back to the blacksmith here, we can see we've got a modulator node. I'm just going to set the settings a bit more extreme so we can hear it a little bit more clearly. Again, double clicking on the node just to play from that particular part of the sound cue. Now notice in this system the placement of the modulator just after the looping node. So this looping node is going to count to 3. And each time it calls it, the modulator is going to pick a new random volume. Let's compare that to the cricket sound cue. Notice the placement of the modulator node here. As the looping delay comes round, it's going to pick some random settings. Again, volume between 0.2 and 1.05, and those are going to apply to the whole set of loops. Not each individual cricket. If we'd put the modulator here, it would apply to each individual cricket. If we can vary the volume, then we can also vary the volume over time. And this is where the enveloper node comes in. In our meadow area, over here, we've got some trees at the edge of the meadow, and we have some wind passing through those trees. In our first example, we have a wave player, and this sound is about 12 seconds long. So what we've done is create a series of envelopes to vary that sound. When editing your enveloper, you need to be quite careful that it never drops below the 0 mark because the sound will simply stop. So if you're applying curves, if you right click, you can choose to apply different types of curves. You need to be careful that it doesn't force the sound to drop below 0. This is particularly a problem if you do it early on in the sound, like here, for example. When we come to play back our enveloper, we're not actually going to hear anything at all. That first example of wind in the trees was actually generating quite a lot of variation from that one sound held in memory. But of course, if we throw in a few different sounds and have the envelopers randomly applied to those sounds, then we're going to get lots more variation. Going back to the meadow, we can also see at the far end, we've got this collection of beehives. Looking at the B sound cue, we can see that we're using the enveloper again with a volume modulation and a fixed pitch, but then we are using an envelope on the pitch itself. So we get the original version with some volume modulation. Now a variation of that with a pitch envelope and another variation and another one. So we've got one sound in memory, but we're getting lots of variety from that sound. Notice also with this sound cue the additional delay at the beginning, prior to our looping delay system starting. This is if we have a few instances of this sound cue in close proximity to each other. We don't want them all starting at the same time, so we put a randomized delay in there so that they start slightly offset from each other. We're going to look at one final example of using the enveloper node, and that's for this nighttime ambience where the winds may be picked up a bit. Now here, the sound itself has got quite an abrupt start because actually that's a loop. So obviously at the beginning of the sound, we're not going to have that nice fade in that we might normally have because it needs to join with the end of the sound and make a nice loop. So what we've got here is just a little enveloper that's going to fade in the sound at the beginning. And then as the sound loops around, we've got another enveloper here that is actually set itself to loop. Now the sound is 11 seconds long, and the enveloper, as you can see, is set to 24 seconds. So we come back to that idea of asynchronous loops. If this envelope and the sound itself are going to slip in and out of phase with each other and constantly create a new varying wind sound. One thing you just need to watch out for, if you are going to loop your envelope, then make sure that the volume at the beginning and the volume at the end are exactly the same, obviously, so that when it loops back round, we're not going to get a sudden change in volume. Creating and editing envelopes in this internal curve editor is just a case of holding Shift down and clicking to create a new envelope point, and right-clicking to select what kind of curve you want, and then obviously deleting it if you decide to change your mind. When you create a new envelope, what might be a little bit confusing at first is the fact that the editor starts in a very zoomed in way on the horizontal axis. So if we put our first envelope point here, we're actually putting it at 0.16 of a second. So sometimes it's good to start with actually entering the values and then using these zoom to fit vertical and horizontal, so we get something that's a bit more recognizable in terms of the kind of values you might want for volume envelopes over time. Pitch and volume are very useful tools for varying your sounds, and applying these changes over time using an envelope opens up a whole new range of possibilities.